Day 46, downtown Halifax. I woke up at Micmac Mall, a place that I visited countless times as a child. I had been car camping here since my arrival a few days ago. I had been car camping in urban areas for so long that I was quite comfortable by now. Today, I would finally have an opportunity to explore the city. Since my arrival in Nova Scotia, I have spent so much time enjoying myself, I haven't done anything that I needed to do throughout my travels. After I arrived in my hometown of Halifax a few days ago, I've been doing my laundry, catching up on emails, documenting my travels, and so forth. Since I was finally caught up with everything, I would be able to spend the day enjoying my hometown. I left Dartmouth, crossed over the Angus MacDonald Bridge, and headed south to the York Redoute National Historic Site. This was a place that I actually never visited during my childhood. The gates were open and I was the first person there. I walked around this historic site, admiring the cannons, looking at the historic plaques and the reinforced buildings. York Redoute was surprisingly older than Canada itself by nearly 100 years. While York Redoute was a National Historic Site, it wasn't anywhere near as restored or well laid out as Grand Pre, which I visited just days ago. This seemed quite barren, and while not necessarily messy, it did seem somewhat disorganized. Perhaps during the pandemic, priorities changed here, but nevertheless, it was an interesting site to explore. I walked numerous barracks, reinforced buildings, and cannons of all shapes and sizes. I tried to move these cannons, or view them in such a manner that I could imagine how to operate them. While they were only for display, my understanding was that these were the actual and original cannons used to defend this location. I wandered the expansive site, climbing onto the cannon mounts, trying to gain entry into the barracks and see what other interesting relics I could find. Closer to the shoreline was a walking path where I came across a couple who knew right away that I was a visitor. Not very many people in Halifax would be walking around wearing a red cowboy hat and carrying a camera. They asked me if I visited the battery down by the shore. I told them that I hadn't and I didn't know where it was. They indicated a path leading down to the battery and explained that it was a graffiti-filled area that was interesting to see. I thanked them for the recommendation and headed on over to see what I could find. A steel door that was left open led down a dark-lit stairwell that brought me to the York Battery. I descended quite a distance before reaching this interesting spot. This wasn't just a place where street artists practiced their graffiti. This was a place where people used graffiti as their voice to express whatever was on their mind, even if their mind wasn't right. And naturally, wasn't that something that Canadians fought for? The right to express themselves? At this time, no one really knew what freedom was anymore. With the global restrictions in place, society was crumbling. But here I was on the shores of Halifax overlooking the Atlantic Ocean where I grew up. As I peered into the horizon, something magnificent came into view. A French Freme frigate, followed by a Canadian Coast Guard vessel, was coming into the Halifax harbor. While I have never served, I wanted to salute the warship, even though they would have never seen me or knew I was there. It gave me great pride that a French warship was visiting not only Canada but my home province of Nova Scotia and my hometown of Halifax. I continued exploring the York Battery, and like Peggy's Cove a few days earlier, I found myself hopping from one concrete form to the next, dangling precariously in some areas. I had to proceed with caution as a fall onto the rocks below would certainly lead to serious injury. Also, given that no one knew that I was all the way here on the opposite side of the country would have been disastrous. I explored additional paths that led away from the York Battery and led deeper into the surrounding woods. I came across a small building that was so dilapidated that I didn't even want to venture into it. I came across a path that led into a cave, with some green substance oozing out of the entrance. Again, I considered entering, but I knew for liability's sake I shouldn't. I enjoyed my time here, but I decided to move on. I retraced my steps back to my beast, taking an alternate path and eventually finding myself in the parking lot. By now, there were a few more visitors, not many, but enough to make me come to the conclusion that this was a site that was seldom visited. I checked my Google Maps to see what else I could find in the area that I haven't visited before. I found Sir Sanford Fleming Park. I vaguely remember this park, and I knew I had visited as a child. Since it wasn't too far away, I decided to visit once more to see if I could find anything I could remember from it. Unfortunately, upon my arrival, I wasn't able to recognize anything aside from the name itself. I looked up at the memorial tower, which had the option of actually climbing the steps to the top. Due to restrictions, this option was no longer available. Two stone lions sat at the base of the tower as if to protect it from intruders. I didn't know anything about the history of this tower or the person of Sanford Fleming. Despite peaceful and beautiful surroundings, nothing here was interesting or exciting. I did find a washroom where I was able to cleanse myself further since I was missing showering for so long. One place I wanted to visit was the Halifax Memorial Bell Tower. Located closer to downtown Halifax, I parked at the hill and walked my way up to the memorial. During this time, I wasn't the only one who was there, as there were others enjoying the park, and there was a group of school children who must have been there for a field trip. The design of the Halifax Memorial Bell Tower itself seemed quite modern. A triangular-shaped concrete structure with plaques to remind everyone of one of the worst man-made tragedies to occur in Atlantic Canada. Overall, I didn't find myself impressed with this architecture. I would expect something much more historic or aligned with the time of the event, rather than something that a young child could have conjured up in a sketch. Regardless, it was the significance that mattered the most. Over 2,000 people perished in this tragedy and many more injured. This event changed Halifax permanently. There were several steel bells mounted underneath the steel canopies of the structure, and while I was wandering the grounds, the bells rang out. They were quite loud and startled me at first. I didn't spend too much time here, but it was nice to see this historic monument as I had never been here as a child. My next destination for the day was not too far away. Just below the McKay Bridge was Africville. This too was another area of Halifax with significant historic importance. I parked just below the McKay Bridge, a bridge that I have crossed countless times as a youth. I found Africville to be nearly empty. Only a few people wandering the grounds like myself. The story of Africville was another dark moment in Canadian history. People of African descent who escaped slavery in the United States were given this land to live on, with the promise of equal opportunities. Unfortunately, they were betrayed, and the land was mainly inhospitable. Despite this, the community banded together, and throughout the decades, they built a solid, close-knit fellowship that became Africville. In the end, the government destroyed Africville just as the community began to show its resilience. To this day, the injustice has not been recognized, and no real reconciliation efforts have been made. There were a number of beautiful plaques in both English and French that described the life and history of Africville. The ground themselves were very well maintained, and it was somewhat disheartening to see that many of the places I've seen were quite busy with visitors, yet no one was here to learn about Africville. I continued to wander the grounds, reading the plaques and learning how the people of Africville escaped the racism of the United States. only to be discriminated against in Canada as well. The government purposely destroyed a lot of the records of Africville. Therefore, the majority of the history was told through stories of the descendants of Africville. The setting itself was beautiful, just along the Bedford Basin, along the upper end of Halifax Harbor. There was a museum on the grounds, but again, due to the pandemic, it was closed. Regardless, it was good to visit Africville and learn about the history of my hometown. As much as I loved my home province and my country, I knew that it had its fair share of wrongdoings. I lingered here for a while, looking around at the beautiful landscape. A lot of the things Africville had at the time were things that would be nearly impossible to find in major cities across Canada. A sense of community where children could play freely and people never locked their doors, where everyone helped each other overcome the hardship of daily life. In so many ways, Africville was a real community, a community that was built from the ground up based on challenges that people faced sheerly on the basis of their ethnicity. While I've been enjoying every moment of being back in Nova Scotia and visiting many of the wonderful places I've never been to or haven't been to since childhood, I also felt a sense of sadness from visiting the Halifax Memorial Bell Tower and now Africville. I decided to head to a place I had visited numerous times as a child, the Halifax Citadel. Perched atop a hill overlooking Halifax Harbor and its surroundings was the famous Halifax Citadel. I came to this hill every winter as a child, as many other children did, to enjoy tobogganing down the slopes of this hill. This time, in the midst of a warm summer, I came to explore the Citadel itself. I found parking at the base of the Halifax Citadel, then walked my way up the hill to one of the entrances. I walked by one of the numerous plaques. Upon entering, I realized that this site had an entrance fee, and I actually wandered through the rear exit. Looking foolish, I eventually found the official entrance, paid my fee, and apologized to the staff after explaining my embarrassing situation. Upon entry, I was greeted by several cadets who spoke to me in French. I had to explain to them in my less than ideal French that I spoke English. Thankfully, the cadets were gracious enough not to laugh at my strong Nova Scotian accent, mixed with an honorable attempt to speak French. They guided me throughout the entrance of the Citadel and explained to me the new regulations under COVID restrictions. Overall, the Halifax Citadel was free to explore. There were some areas that were cordoned off, but overall I was able to immerse myself in the history of this iconic site. The Halifax Citadel was very well laid out and immaculately maintained. While it was made to be accessible for anyone, the steep stairs would have made it impossible for anyone in a wheelchair to access the upper portions of the walls. The stone walls, while having signs of age, were still maintained in such a manner that they displayed authenticity while maintaining function. The interior buildings have naturally been upgraded over the years for proper building codes, but were recreated to be as authentic as possible. Along the sprawling interior courtyard were numerous cannons, displays, and weapons of all sorts. This was quite similar to the Ottawa War Museum, but in an outdoor setting, and a much more original site. There were a number of cadets displaying the function of period area weapons and showcasing their use of both English and French. The British flag was flown in and around the Halifax Citadel, along with masts whose purpose was completely unknown to me. I didn't participate in any of the activities or guided tours here, but there was one event I wanted to see in person. The historic firing of the cannon at noon. Unfortunately, I was there quite early, so it would have been some time before I would be able to witness this event. Surprisingly, there were quite a number of visitors to the site, which was interesting to see. I wandered into one of the buildings and found several interesting displays. Some of the displays were interactive, but I was more interested in the plaques. One of the interesting things I learned was that the hill that Halifax Citadel sits on itself had been rebuilt numerous times, and it was not a natural hill as it was created by sediment that was deposited by a glacier long ago. The British, who were at war with the French at the time, had to expand and rebuild this massive fortress as the ground conditions proved to be difficult to host such a fortress. The design of the Halifax Citadel was quite angular when looking down from an aerial view. The elevation, combined with the physics of inclination and gravity, would have been proven to make this a very difficult building to overthrow. With time, the technology of military weapons made it such that the Halifax Citadel would have been attacked at a distance with newer weaponry, so its status as being impenetrable began to fade away. This meant that the Halifax Citadel would be repurposed for other uses, such as training of new recruits or the detention of prisoners of war. I continued to wander through the many buildings and naturally the many levels with displays that ignited my imagination. Along with the many displays of historical content, there were displays of Canadian heroes, in particular those of Nova Scotian or Atlantic Canadian heritage. These were true heroes, like those at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. These brave Canadians sacrificed to keep Canada and its allies free. The freedom that we enjoyed came at a human cost, the ultimate cost, and these heroes would be immortalized for their actions. As the weather was slightly overcast and not nearly as sunny as it was at Peggy's Cove a few days ago, I decided to explore the grounds and upper walls. The views from the walls offered panoramic vistas of Halifax. This was my hometown, my city, and after decades I have returned. Since crossing into Nova Scotia from New Brunswick, I had felt at peace, at home, and alive. This was the place of my earliest memories, from Annapolis Valley to Lunenburg and then Peggy's Cove and finally here in Halifax. Every day of being back in my home province brought back life into my soul. I remember weeks ago back in Toronto when I was standing at the water, looking back towards Victoria in the west and then looking east towards Halifax. I finally arrived. I finally made it. I was finally home. In the beginning of my trip, I left Victoria with excitement, leaving an unhappy work life and all the problems that came with this pandemic. I never thought I would make it to Atlantic Canada, as the entire region of Atlantic Canada was closed off to non-residents at the time of my travels. Throughout all the hardships I endured over the past year prior to the beginning of my trip, I was able to experience an adventure of a lifetime and travel all across the country to my hometown. I looked over at the Halifax Citadel's walls at my hometown, not a perfect place by far, and not a place I could see myself living in again. But it was still my hometown, and I was proud of being from here. I walked down the stone steps and out the exit of the Halifax Citadel. Walking down the hill, I peered back up to the Halifax town clock, just east of the Halifax Citadel. At the time, I didn't realize it, but it was just before noon. I continued walking down towards the Halifax ferry terminal when a shot rang out so damn loud I jumped and nearly tumbled down the damn hill. I looked back and saw smoke rising from the walls behind the Halifax Citadel. I realized it was noon and the cannon was fired. After stumbling a little bit, I gathered myself to look around. I could easily tell those who were residents of Halifax and those who weren't. Those who were residents carried on like nothing occurred at all, while myself and others who were gathering their senses were the visitors. I tried not to look too embarrassed as I continued walking downhill towards the Halifax ferry terminal. I passed by a pedestrian area with a lot of cool shops and restaurants, which reminded me of the Sparks Street area in Ottawa. It wasn't nearly as busy, and actually seemed quite empty, but it was cool to see how Halifax has improved its downtown core since I was here decades ago. I eventually arrived at the Halifax City Hall. While it wasn't a large building like the Parliament building in Victoria, it was very well restored. It actually seemed out of place to be so well restored for something so old, while many of the nearby buildings were much more modern. Naturally, touring inside the Halifax City Hall itself was not possible due to the restrictions, so that meant that I would have another reason to return to my hometown in the future. The Halifax City Hall sits on a block in downtown Halifax called the Grand Parade. It wasn't a large area, but it was cool to have a beautifully maintained park in the middle of a commercialized urban downtown core. There were a number of memorials here, commemorating and remembering the sacrifices of the men and women who fought the wars that kept peace and freedom around the world. Again, this entire park, including the Halifax City Hall, was empty due to the restrictions. But I knew that when the restrictions were finally lifted, it would be quite busy with visitors and locals alike. I continued walking past the Grand Parade and closer to the Halifax Harbor when I came across an interesting-looking mural. It was obviously based on the aquatic life around the Atlantic Ocean. It was quite colorful and reminded me of the interesting murals I had seen around the Rue Saint Laurent area in Montreal. Taking up an entire wall, it was something that one would never miss when walking around the downtown core of Halifax. Just below the mural was some construction work, and I just seen a man there chilling and relaxing. Back in Victoria, he would have been yelled at for not being productive, which reminded me of how I left the rat race of the West Coast and how the East Coast was much more relaxed. I continued onwards where I came across the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. While I do appreciate art, I was never artistic in any sense, at least not in a way that I would ever visit an art gallery on my own. The building itself, similar to the Halifax City Hall, was made of dark stone and very well maintained. Its architecture was that of an era long before my time. I walked along another pedestrian-only area, this time nearly empty despite it being past noon by now. It was strange that this pedestrian-only area would be absolutely barren during the lunchtime. But then it just reminded me of how things were back in Victoria's downtown core. After being in such iconic capital cities such as Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec, all of the other capital cities I've visited so far seemed ordinary, including Halifax. But it was still my hometown, and it was great to be back. I came across a few more colorful murals on the streets until I noticed something in the distance. Like Ottawa, I noticed a spire of a church not too far away. I turned around and headed toward it. While not nearly as majestic as some of the churches I've seen during my trip across the country, it still was a beautiful sight to see in downtown Halifax. This was St. Mary's Basilica, a church that had stood long before Canada was even a country. Due to the restrictions, it would not have been possible to enter. The solid stone construction, old-fashioned wooden doors, and Gothic-inspired architecture was a beacon of beauty amongst the surrounding commercial buildings. Like many other capital cities, such as Ottawa, it was common to find vagrants at the front of the main church, as this was the only location they knew they had a sense of safety. From here I walked down to the waterfront promenade. While the pedestrian-only areas I visited just earlier were completely barren, the promenade had people present. Being that this would be an area that would normally see a lot of traffic from visitors, there were a number of plaques and memorials here as well. Some of the memorials were about those who were lost at sea, while some were about those who fought for Canadian rights and freedoms. Some were also about the expulsion of the Acadians, a story told in depth when I visited the Grand Pré National Historic Site just days ago. In the distance, I was also able to see George's Island, a place that I have never been to. Perhaps when I return to Halifax in the future, I would take the opportunity to enjoy the things I wasn't able to experience on this particular adventure. I continued exploring, passing the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, as well as numerous eateries and shops. The promenade was wide enough that people had plenty of room to walk, jog, or ride a bicycle leisurely. There was a small playground as well, and it was great to see families enjoying themselves and finding some level of peace in such a mad time in modern history. Perhaps in time the world would return to normal, but I didn't know quite when. I continued exploring until I reached the Canada sign. From here it was the end of the promenade, and so I decided to return to my beast and explore another area. A short drive led me to Point Pleasant Park. Strangely adjacent to the Irving shipbuilding facility, this park seemed out of place. Or did it? Perhaps it was the Irving shipbuilding facility that was out of place. Regardless, Point Pleasant Park was quite expansive, so I took the time to explore the area, keeping close to the shore. I came across a number of monuments along the way, including one of the massive anchors from the HMCS Bonaventure. There were other monuments along my walk that I came across. Most of these monuments were military by nature. Point Pleasant Park wasn't anything as spectacular as Stanley Park in Vancouver in regards to the beautiful scenery, or Majors Hill Park in Ottawa in regards to cleanliness, but it was still a natural escape from the urban environment of a downtown core. Walking clockwise for some time, I decided to explore further away from the shore and deeper into the park itself. Many well-maintained paths lead to various directions, and I eventually found myself at the Prince of Wales Tower. This seemed to be such a strange building to have in such a strange area. The Prince of Wales Tower was a round tower that was used for coastal defense in an era long ago. It had stone construction and was part of a series of coastal defenses protecting Halifax from enemy combatants. I wanted to enter, but unfortunately entry seemed to be denied, either due to the restrictions or for public safety. Being that this structure was built long before Canada was even a country, I would have enjoyed learning the history of this strange building situated in a park. Shortly after exploring Point Pleasant Park further, I decided to head back to the parking lot and back to my beast. It was mid-afternoon now, and this was my last day in Halifax. I fired up my beast, set a course for Port Hawkesbury on Cape Breton Island. This was the first time I would have ever been to Cape Breton Island. I drove out of Halifax, over the McDonald Bridge into Dartmouth and northeast on Highway 118 until it turned into Highway 102, well outside the city limits. I drove for some time, stopping in Stewiacke for food and petrol along the way. It was nice to be back in a rural setting, passing through smaller towns along the way. I headed into Truro once more, and then took Highway 104 east until I reached the famous Canso Causeway. It was early evening by now, and I passed through the link that connected the mainland of Nova Scotia to Cape Breton Island. I had a wonderful time on the mainland of Nova Scotia, revisiting the places of my past as well as exploring places I've never been to before. Now I found my place to car camp for the evening. I parked my beast at the corner of the Walmart parking lot, dropped my rear seats down, and inflated my air mattress. I settled down for the evening, thinking about my time back in my hometown. How wonderful it had been to be home after decades. So many emotions filled my mind, but one emotion lingered: my sense of adventure, as tomorrow would be a new day, and a new adventure was waiting for me.
Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.